This podcast is brought to you by Barry's Tea. Recently, I visited the home of Barry's Tea in Cork and saw firsthand the skill and expertise of their master blender, making sure that every cup of Barry's Tea is of the highest quality. As a chef, I'm obsessed with flavour, and for me, Barry's Tea is the best tasting tea in Ireland. More than that, it also brings with it a sense of home, belonging and connection. Just one sip of Barry's Tea and you're home. So stick the kettle on, make a cup of Barry's Tea and enjoy the podcast. So spuds, Brian.
Yes, spuds, yeah.
Of all the ingredients in the world, you wanted spuds, lightly dressed with some butter and some salt. And you say you like them steamed in their jackets was one of the points you made.
And you've got new potatoes. I mean, we're probably a bit beyond the new potato season, but you've got a special source of them.
Yeah, as a chef, there's certain warehouses where they hold them.
Well, I love them because they're such a versatile food, aren't they? You can do so many different things with them. I mean, you've presented them here with a little bit of some herbs, I think, and a little bit of salt and
I had to add something pizzazz to it.
Absolutely delicious. And these are new season, and then you get the main crop. So, it gets us right through the year. My wife is a gardener and has an allotment. So every year we get new season potatoes and then the crops that come in later. And so, I always look forward to that. And I've been eating and cooking potatoes most of my adult life. Eating potatoes all my life. Sure, I mean, who in this country doesn't eat potatoes?
Well, it's kind of the Irish thing. But you're clearly into food. I'll tell you, you don't know this story. And this is a very famous story in my house. So when I was 15, I decided I wanted to be a chef. And it was transition year. Was coming along. So I decided I'm going to send a letter to what I considered to be the best restaurants in the country at the time. Sent them off to 10 and I got a couple of responses back, including one from Nev Maguire. So myself and my friend anyway went up the road. It would have been 2007, 2008 maybe. Yeah. And we went up to Nevin's for 2 weeks. And on the last Saturday of our second week, Nevin said, we've got a cancellation, lads, in the restaurant for 2 and we'd like you to have the table.
Oh, fantastic.
So amazing. And I was worried because I hadn't packed any fancy clothes. I only had my hoodies and my tracksuits. He said, you can wear whatever you want. So anyway, we're sat there on the Saturday night and have a great night. And we get picked up the next day and we're on the road home. And my mum says to me, well, how was it? And we'd been in the kitchen for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I said, you won't believe it, Mum. We were sat in the restaurant last night and there was a table beside us with about 8 people. And guess who was on the table? Bryan Dobson was on the table. And she goes, Mark, you've been up here for 2 weeks working. And that was the highlight. We were like, but it was Bryan Dobson.
Oh, well, I'm sure there are other highlights as well.
But that was, my question to you is, you do hold it's an iconic status in Irish life, whether you want it or not.
Okay, yeah, whether I want it or not, yeah. I think I might remember that occasion because I haven't been to Nevin's too often, probably 3 or 4 times maybe, and I think I remember that occasion. And I think what also happened that night was that we had a taxi booked. But Nevin came out afterwards and invited us to have an after-dinner drink, and we had a drink and then another drink, and he sent the taxi away. So we're sitting there in Blackline. Now we had to get back we have a house about half an hour's run away in across the border in County Leitrim, a parish called Ballinaglara, so near between Drumshambo and Dara, so in that sort of general area. So that's where we had to get back to, and eventually his wife drove us home. Really? Because we couldn't race a taxi by the time.
There was a few of you, I remember.
There was probably a little gang of us, yeah. It might have been an occasion where I had some of my buddies up and we were staying over, and a few of them might have stayed in Nevin's. It's a wonderful restaurant. And it just shows you the power, the draw of food, because it's a destination. People go there from all over the country. And I think if you're looking at a reservation, you can forget about it until sometime in 2026, If
you can send Nevin a little text every now and then, you can squeeze it. But that was the thing for me as a kid. I was 15 at the time. It was that Bryan Dobson was there. So do you get a sense from, now I know you retired, you were 40 years at it, that sort of place you would hold in Irish life?
I think I do. I think probably since I retired, that's become more conscious of it than I might have been before, because I got a lot of messages from people. I got a lot of texts, I got a lot of emails, I got letters, cards, and I was surprised at that reaction. And I got a lot of media interest. I got a lot of requests for interviews. I ended up having been an interviewer, for 30 or 40 years, having the tables reversed on me and doing quite a few interviews with the papers and with yourself and others. And I suppose that I began to realise, there's a bit of interest in this, and I suppose it's because if somebody's been such a familiar figure in people's lives, on the news every night. And
in people's living rooms.
Yeah, literally in their homes. And I was always very conscious of that I was in people's homes. But when, in my case, the time comes to retire, then people maybe just sort of pause for a moment because they measure their own lives by that. Oh, there's somebody who's been doing the job they've been doing for 35 years. I remember them, as you say, maybe as a child or as a teenager. So it's a little punctuation mark in people's lives maybe when something like that happens. Yeah.
And big moments, like things that happen. I meant to ask you a bit further on, but like one of the things I remember is you get moments in history, and particularly when I was younger, it's kind of framed by the 6-1 news or the 9 o'clock news that you'd be sitting down with your parents, because obviously we didn't have sort of the social media. But would you have gotten a sense now going on certain days that this is a big moment or this is a big bulletin or something?
Oh yes, very definitely. I mean, most big stories are obviously big at the time. So the Good Friday Agreement or 9/11 or big general election day, it's pretty obvious this is a big story. There are some stories that you realise afterwards this was a big story. Maybe we didn't quite realise it at the time. I think the economic collapse, the banking collapse, that was much more of a slow motion disaster really that played out in small ways over months and maybe even years, and we're still living with the consequences of it. So, but for the most part, big stories are you're very conscious of it. And in the era that I was presenting, there was also that sense that people were tuning in for the news. They hadn't seen it on a phone beforehand. They hadn't got the access to the instant information that we have now. And I think it was also where that was changing as the years went by. That in the latter stages, I was working on Morning Ireland and News at One, and if a big story broke in mid-morning, people would be aware of it. Obviously, because of the way technology works now, before they turned on the news at lunchtime. So, and that again began to change the way I think that we looked at how we covered a story. We needed to bring something fresh and new to it. And by the time we got on air, even something that had maybe only happened a couple of hours previously, just because of the news cycle has sped up so dramatically.
A few months ago, there was a fascinating, I think it was an interview or podcast with Jon Snow from Channel 4. Speaking, I think he spoke at length about particularly 9/11 and about that day as a news anchor, and I suppose the battle for him of his job, which is to give a nice balanced opinion of just the facts that are actually happening versus his emotions. And I don't want to specifically lead you down that, but can you remember that day specifically? And
yes, I can, because I was in the centre of Dublin. I was having lunch, and I met I was due to do an interview with a man called Richard Haas, who was President George Bush's envoy to Ireland, and he was visiting Dublin, and he was in government buildings meeting Bertie Ahern, and there was a news conference, and then I was heading to government buildings to record an interview with him. And I met somebody on the street who said there's something about a plane hitting a building in New York, and I, oh right, what's that? And then by the time I got round to government buildings, I think the second plane had hit, and Richard Haas and Bertie Ahern and their officials came out, made a brief statement, and that was it. There was no interview. So I headed straight back to RT and went on air, I think at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
So what happens when you walk through the doors of RT?
They said, get your tie and jacket on and get on air. Yeah. So we were already on air.
Yeah.
Anthony Murnane, who's subsequently one of the editors of the news, was presenting, and he'd gone in, and then I came in and I took it from there, and with others, and Uno Hagan, I think, was a colleague on there at the time, and went through to about 9 or 10 o'clock that night.
Straight through, like a constant news bulletin of... Yeah, just constantly. And there was very little material, because again, it was an era before mobile phones, and there was a few bits of footage of the planes going overhead and one or two of them hitting the building. But then the cameras, once the enormity of what was happening was clear, there were live cameras on it. So by the time the buildings collapsed, that was on live TV. I mean, that was... I assume, obviously hindsight's easy now. I think I was only 11 or 12 at the time. I assume you're sat there that day going, this is going to be one in my 40-year career. This is going to be a standout. Yeah,
I mean, I think you kind of, as I say, it's a moment the world is never going to be the same again. And it was just a horrifying story to be covering. And people remember some of those in the buildings jumping off.
Yeah.
And Conor O'Cleary, who was an Irish Times correspondent in New York, was witnessing all this, and he was one of the people we got on the phone to talk about what was happening, and he was describing this happening. And
how were your emotions when that sort of happened?
well, I think what happens when you're involved in covering the story, the professional side kicks in,
Yeah.
and it's afterwards sometimes when you reflect back on what you've been reporting about that the emotional impact hits you. At the time, generally the focus is on the job.
Yeah.
What can we say about what's happening? Who do we am I interviewing? Who can talk to me? What questions should I be asking? What information should we be getting?
And I can imagine a marathon bulletin like that of been live on air for 6 or 7 hours is
Again,
incredibly draining.
it doesn't feel like it. Yeah, it's after the event when you come off air, you kind of deflate maybe. So I think the adrenaline keeps you going. I've done long broadcasts, I've done election broadcasts, and I've done all that. And generally, I think the energy of the story carries you through, and it's afterwards that you kind of flop.
And are there any other moments then that you would have enjoyed more? Obviously, that's an incredibly depressing moment, but are there highlights from the last 40 years where you go, God, that was one of the great days, or particularly in your job?
Yeah, I loved elections, and I loved I love election counts, and I love election results, and I love doing those programs, and I did those as a reporter and then as a presenter from the late 90s through until the last general election. And there's a great clarity about the general election results day or days. Often it can take a couple of days that you can't really argue with the numbers. The spin stops here. And I think as well from politicians, and I spend a lot of time interviewing politicians and dealing with them.
Do you enjoy that?
I do, yeah, of course I do, yeah. I wouldn't have stuck at it so long. There's sort of honesty, there's a clarity, and then it's back to maybe business as usual after that. But so election days are great, and I've covered elections in Ireland, and I've covered elections in the States, and I've covered elections in Britain, and I've covered South African election was an extraordinary, the first one, but that Mandela was elected. So those would be among the highlights. Yeah.
I remember I was doing a bit of research on you. You spoke about, you started, was it up north? The BBC?
BBC.
And I think there was a story, it may have been during the Troubles, when you were potentially a more naive version of the reporter getting chased from
one
of the lines.
Yeah, I got stuck in a riot in a town called Castlewellan in County Down. So it's in the Mourne Mountains.
What age are you at this stage?
I was about 23 or something.
Okay,
early mid-20s, and the police had banned a loyalist parade, and they'd sealed off the town. And reporters like myself were all there, covering the story.
You get sent up.
Dispatched down to cover. And some of the loyalist bandsmen, the fellas with the flutes and the drums, they managed to circumvent the police lines by coming over a mountain or something like that. And they arrived in the town determined to march. Okay. And the cops confronted them, and they confronted the cops, and there was a set to. And I was covering it. And what happened was, I think there might have been 2 police lines. And I discovered later this is a kind of fairly normal tactic. But at one point, the front line melted away, and I was between the police, the remaining line, and the rioters. And these lads spotted me, and they set
You're
off
in
after
no man's
me.
land.
Yeah. So anyway, over a wall I jumped and through a forest, and I managed to get away from them. But I was a bit more careful about where I put myself on police lines after that.
It's mad to think that was going on in Ireland.
It's 30 years ago, but it was a good while ago. But it's well within living memory. Yeah, it is crazy.
Come a long way from that.
Yeah, of course we have, and that's been the big change. One of the big changes in my career in journalism has been the political settlement in Northern Ireland, and it was a great story to cover, and it was full of hope, and it's obviously had its ups and downs since, but there hasn't been any significant return to violence. That's a great testament to those who put that deal together.
And do you see that going continuing like that into the future?
Yeah, I don't see a return to violence. No, I think. I think politics is paramount in Northern Ireland. It's difficult sometimes and it's intractable, but I think that's where it's at. Yeah.
Take me back then back to Bryan Dobson, the person, as opposed to the broadcaster, to childhood. What sort of food would you have eaten growing up? Where did you grow up? Where did this all start?
Well, you see, I grew up in 1960s, 1970s Ireland, Dublin, and there wasn't really
Fine dining.
Yeah, there wasn't really a culture of dining or eating out or anything like that. I mean, if we ate out, we'd go to a local hotel, for a Sunday lunch. That was eating out. I mean, I'm not sure there was my dad worked in the wine business, the wine and spirit business, but we didn't drink wine, other than maybe at Christmas. Sherry, it was always a little glass of sherry to be had.
Very old school.
And and I remember him talking about his boss, the man who owned the company. It was a small importers. I think he used to go to dinner in the Lord Edward, which was still is above the pub there in near Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin, and that was considered very exotic that you'd go out to a dinner, out to a restaurant to have dinner.
That wasn't a thing.
No, it wasn't at all. No, but my mum really, I don't think she was that interested in food either for the consumption of it or the preparation. Yeah. She had a very busy and active life in lots of other ways, and she used to say if she could just give everybody a pill, she'd be quite happy.
There's no food culture at all at home.
So
really.
I think she was happy as 20. Her idea of a good meal was somebody else prepared it and somebody else did the washing up.
Yeah.
And I often wonder about my dad because I think my grandmother, her mother, was actually quite a good cook. Certainly, I remember my dad made a few references to that over the years, and my grandmother had worked in domestic service back in the day, so maybe she picked up some of her skills there. I don't know. So I often wondered, what did my dad get a bit of a land when he discovered, that his new bride perhaps hadn't followed in her mother's footsteps. But so there wasn't we were well fed. It was nourishing food.
Were there many of you?
There was two of us, myself and a younger sister.
And what sort of food would you have eaten sort of midweek or?
Well, every day seemed to have its own meal. So Monday would have been what were called rissoles. Have you ever heard of rissoles? They're basically the meat that's left over from the roast on Sunday.
Okay.
Sort of put together in like a little burger with some seasoning. So that'd be Monday. I can't remember what Tuesday.
So there were set days, set dishes.
Oh yeah. Thursday was a stew, which I never liked particularly, I can't. So my mother was a very good pastry cook, actually, and she made wonderful pies and tarts and sausage rolls. So on a Saturday we would often have sausage rolls.
Very nice.
With her own pastry, and that's a little skill I picked up from her. So I can turn my hand to making pastry.
This was all in Dublin. You grew up in Dublin.
In Dublin, yeah.
And moving on to the world of broadcasting and journalism, did you always know this was something you were going to be in? Did you fall in by chance?
Well, I got the bug really, I suppose, in my school years. You mentioned transition year, and I was in transition year, an early pilot program of transition year, and part of that involved some media modules and producing a radio program and a magazine and stuff, and that's where I got bitten by the journalism. So I kind of I drifted away to maybe have some other interest, but by the time I left school, that's what I wanted to do.
So you set up a radio station in school.
We set up a radio program. We made and recorded a radio program, and
where was that?
In New Park, Comprehensive Black Rock.
Yeah.
So New Park was
just around the corner.
Yeah, right. New Park was one of the first schools to do transition year. Yeah. I mean, this is the 1970s, so it was very early.
How was transition year viewed in the 1970s?
Well, I don't know, because I don't know what it's like today, but for me it was great. I really enjoyed it. It was just a whole new experience educationally for me, because I was not academic. I wasn't doing terribly well at school. We did the equivalent of the junior cert before transition year, so that was the inter-cert it was called in those days, and I didn't do very good inter-cert, and I didn't do a very good leaving really subsequently, but I suppose I had a clear ambition of where I wanted to go, and that's probably a big help actually, if you know what you want in life.
Just goes to show the importance of something like transition year for certain people.
I'm a big fan of it. Yeah.
Did you always know then you were going to present to 61 News eventually, or was there this master plan? Or
No. I just knew journalism was something for me. Because I suppose I'm nosy and like asking questions and finding out what people think about things, and digging down a bit. And the broadcasting, I suppose, came about because I was never a very good speller, so maybe written journalism wasn't going to be for me. And what happened, I suppose, is I really didn't know how to. I didn't know how do you become a journalist? I mean, there was one third level course in journalism, a certificate or diploma course, and that was it. I mean, today there are degrees and all the rest of it that people can study for. So what was the route? I had no way into it. So I started working in pirate radio.
Okay.
And that was my route into broadcasting, into journalism.
What were you doing on the pirate radio station?
Reading the news.
Oh, so literally from day
I
one.
was never a DJ. Yeah.
Thank you to Barry's Tea for supporting this podcast. Barry's Tea holds a special place in people's hearts. Not just because it tastes amazing, but because as Irish people, Barry's Tea is one of those special things that connects us with home and that sense of belonging. We drink it in cafes, in restaurants, at book clubs, when we're out hiking. We even bring it on holidays and drink it all over the world. No matter where you are or what you're doing, one sip of Barry's Tea and you're home. Talk to me then about I've always been interested in the sort of the routine we spoke about before I come in here of what we see on TV between 6 and 7 o'clock, a day in the life. How does, when you get to the office, how does it work presenting the 6-1 news? Do you get up? What do you eat for breakfast? Tell me about the day.
Oh, well, I mean, what I eat for breakfast. Well, these days I eat a couple of Weetabix or a bowl of porridge or something like that and a slice of toast. And the day, I often described it as an upside down day, the reverse of most people's days. Okay, and what I mean by this is I think most people who have normal jobs start off and are fairly quickly into it, and they're probably at their most productive during the early part of the day and maybe the early afternoon. And then I think, if we're honest, things probably tail off a bit. By mid-afternoon, you're beginning to get the slump. If you work in daily journalism, if you do something like working on the 6 o'clock news, 6-1 news, it's quite the reverse. The day starts a bit sort of slow and relaxed. Read the paper, think about a few things, shoot the breeze, chat about what stories we might cover. And then there's a series of editorial meetings during the day where things begin to take shape. And then the pace increases. And then you're at your most busy as you get towards airtime, and then obviously the program is on air. So it's a kind of then
you have a big role in deciding that what's going to be the news of the day.
I would have had a role,
yeah,
but the program has an editor, and the editor, that's where the buck stops. So I would stick my oar in, and sometimes the editors would say that's a good idea, and sometimes they might say no, we're not going to do that. So the whole operation is a collective operation. So there's no one person really guides or directs. So an editor can only draw on the resources of the stories that are available to them. So we have, in RT, we have what's called a news editor who really is responsible for assigning reporters on the stories of the day and making sure camera crews for television are assigned and so on. And it's a really important role because there's only limited resources. No news organisation can cover everything that's happening. So you have to make decisions. You have to say, well, we're going to cover this story today. We're going to send a reporter to cover this story, but that means that something else perhaps isn't going to get covered. So that's a whole editorial process. And again, the news editor is ultimately, I suppose, responsible, but it comes out of that collective consultative process. So the idea that there's sort of a master plan or a guiding hand is to misrepresent the and that's the way I think most news organisations operate.
News finishes and the thing, I don't know, is it the signature of the anchor is it's generally picking up the pieces of paper, giving them the tap, and you turn to, is it Sharon Yvonne or whoever it is, and I always go, are they fake chatting or are they actually chatting? Because it used to happen every single night. So what happens when it ends?
Well, we might just say, well, what are you doing this evening, or what are your plans, or it's usually sort of fairly inconsequential chit chat. Sometimes it might be about a story, something that an interview that might have gone out on air. We might just have a comment about it, but it's very fleeting because
there's no debrief on. Geez, I absolutely smashed that tonight, guys. That was
no. I don't think so. Sharon used to say to me when we had Micheál Martin in for an interview, she said, I hated that because you'd start having an argument with them. And she said, I always felt like it was my parents, having an argument. And I wish they'd stop.
You did have a few back and forths with people through the years.
Yeah, well, that comes with the territory, all right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's I think is to be expected. Yeah.
And do you have a feeling at that point that, look, you're there to represent the people watching this? Because I assume you're quite friendly with some of the people who are coming in your interview.
I hope so, yeah. I think you're there to ask questions, and if people aren't answering them, to ask the question again. And I would have a practice of asking somebody, if I don't get an answer, I will interrupt and I'll ask the question again. I'll do it a couple of times, but then if they're still going to avoid it, move on.
And who were the best at avoiding these through the years?
Well, most of our top politicians are absolutely highly practiced and very capable of ducking and diving and avoiding questions they don't want to answer. And you can see that. I mean, if you're a viewer, you can see that. But the politicians particularly will come on air with a mess. They're coming on air because there's something they want to say. So they have an agenda that they want to pursue.
They've come in briefed as you would be from the other side.
Well, they're. I mean, first of all, they're generally pretty smart. They're bright. They can handle themselves. They can deal with awkward questions because they've risen to the top. So you don't do that by accident. And so there's a kind of fine line sometimes you want to walk between, the interviewee making the points they want to make, because that's potentially news. It's interesting to people. They're talking about things that presumably will affect people's lives, but also there are questions that you as an interviewer want to try to get answers to, and that might be something that the interviewee doesn't want to deal with. So it's a little bit of a tug of war, I think. Yeah, backwards and forwards.
Do you ever get emotionally involved or invested in it?
No.
Because you look like you do sometimes in some of the ones gone back to the years.
No, I don't think so. I think I look upon it as a job.
And are there ever moments then when like the interview ends and you're sat there with someone who you've absolutely roasted for the last 4 minutes and there's the kind of...
Well, I don't know if I've ever absolutely roasted anybody, but generally, Ken, if they've had a tough interview, I think they kind of roll with it as well. And they'll usually just shake your hands and out the door. I don't know what they say about me in the privacy of the car on the way home.
I imagine there's a photo of you on the dartboard inside in the Dáil in a couple of offices through the years. Like on that, on the idea of, you said, of asking the same question over and over again to get the answer you want. Was there a standout person who you loved interviewing, or you would get excited about, or you knew there was going to be, this is going to be better than the average?
Well, you see, the people I would do regularly, it would be, Irish political figures. Yeah. And they're all very different. And they have different ways of handling themselves. Leo Varadkar, Leo would always give you some news lines. Yeah. And would generally answer a question directly. Not always, but generally answer a question directly. And was comfortable, I think, in the news, in the format. Micheál Martin, Micheál would be very clear what he wants to say, would deal with the issues that he wants to deal with in the way that he wants to deal with them, and would be very good on detail, very good on taking you down into the detail of something. So they each have a different quality. I don't know. I haven't interviewed Simon Harris a few times. I interviewed him on my last day as Taoiseach. People know from listening to him, he's very, very capable as well. So they're all on top of their game. Yeah.
I used to love, you kind of knew things were going down when 6-1 came on and Bryan Dobson was in a different location to the studio. That's when you knew, okay, something big was happening.
Something big was happening, yeah.
Talk to me about, are there any standout moments where you got caught up in the middle of a big event, or I know elections in the US, or anything like that stands out?
Well, you're right about that was a deliberate editorial policy as well, if I can describe it as that if we sent a presenter, and it might be me, or it might have been Sharon or Uno Hagan when I worked with her, or Eileen Dunn, or Anne Doyle, they would have all done it on different programs. It was an editorial statement that we think this is of such significance that it's worth giving it that kind of attention and resources. And therefore, we hope that you'll give it your attention.
It was showbiz.
Yeah. So this is part of there's a showbiz element to television broadcast news for certain. So definitely that's the case. Things like US elections are just so exciting. They're wonderful occasions. I did a lot of European summits when a lot of negotiations were going on through the developing the European Union, the different treaties. Remember all that, Lisbon and all the rest of it, Nice, those treaties. So I covered a lot of those. They were always fascinating. I remember on one occasion being on a rooftop somewhere. It might have been in Italy or whatever. It might have been at a summit, and I interviewed the then Minister for Foreign Affairs, who was David Andrews. Okay. I think this was David Andrews, about whatever was happening at the summit. And we were all, in these setups, you're on a line of positions. So I was one of, maybe a dozen reporters, camera, reporter position, backdrop of whatever the venue was behind us. And beside me was somebody from Spanish television, and on the other side was a fellow from ITN. And he was about to do his piece, and I was interviewing David Andrews. And the interview concluded, and this meeting was still going on inside. So David Andrews had come out to speak to us, and then he got back in again. And as I finished up, the ITN reporter started into his live piece, and he said, and I can just tell you, according to the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs, David Andrews, and he quoted from our interview, which had happened a couple of seconds earlier. So we're all sort of feeding off each other a bit, trying to, because you're dealing in these events with really scraps of information. And it would be the same with the negotiations that went on up to and after the Good Friday Agreement. We go up to Stormont or wherever it might be in Belfast to cover a meeting between Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, and you get briefings from both sides, but we're really only getting a fraction of what's going on inside. And this has become more apparent to me as the years have gone by, because now I'm reading some accounts of what was going on in some of these negotiations, because they're 30 years ago now. The documents are available, so you can read. Sometimes the documents are released, or participants are starting to publish accounts of what happened. And you realise really as reporters how little we knew about what was happening behind the scenes. So, maybe, a bit of humility sometimes mightn't go astray in our profession,
Those leaks, are they intentional from different sides?
They usually are. Yeah, they usually are. So you need to treat that kind of information, that briefing, you need to just interrogate it the way you would any information. How reliable is this? What are the other sides saying? But I mean, there's always a reason for a leak.
Yeah,
yeah.
We see as well when you're talking about going to big moments there and interviewing certain people. From a journalistic point of view, it must be a bit of not a dogfight's the wrong word, but you see, the scrum of someone walks out and everyone's in. Do you get involved in that where it's like, I need to get the microphone here first? And
I would have done more of that when I was a younger reporter. As the presenter doesn't have to do so much of that. I'm in my position, my live position. Usually the guests come to us, if they're available. But yeah, I've had a few scrums all right in my day.
Big difference between radio and the TV broadcasting, or exactly the same thing?
There is quite a difference. I mean, the obvious difference is television is driven by pictures.
Yeah,
and a strong picture story will always get coverage or a profile that maybe if it was the same story's been covered for radio, it mightn't have quite the appeal. So that's the main one. A lot more logistics in television.
Yeah.
So to get cameras. Now that's eased off a bit now because technology again has made it easier to get pictures. But back in the day when I was working in television reporting, there were a lot of logistics involved in covering a story for TV that didn't arise in radio. So radio kind of is sort of in a pure news form, I often thought. You can spend more time thinking about the story. A lot of the time on television, you're thinking about the logistics, about getting there, getting the satellite link up, getting the material back, editing it, putting a script together.
Do people stop you in the street nowadays?
Not really. Sometimes people sort of say, "Oh, hello, Brian," or whatever. But no. I'm not actually stopped in the street. No.
How does that sit with you then when you're getting the nod or the?
Well, it was fine because if I was when I was working on the television and I was 5 nights a week on the 6-1 News, if people didn't recognise me, we'd have a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was quite happy to be recognised, and occasionally people would chat about stories, but by and large, no. People I think would leave me be. Yeah.
Which isn't always the case in different places. I think Ireland, a lot of people would say is...
And I think that may have changed actually now. I think certainly a lot of our reporters out and about nowadays would get a lot more hostility, if they're covering protests, covering events. And that's been a change, I think, that reporters are singled out, now. And particularly some of these, more recently, some of the protests around the asylum seeker accommodation
and
so on.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's because there has been, this is it's the fake news issue that people are much less trusting, and in some cases there's outright hostility towards traditional news organisations. And I think I saw that starting around the time of the economic collapse. I think people were obviously very understandably very angry about what happened.
It's about 15 years ago almost.
Yeah.
Starting there.
Yeah, around 2000, 2010, 2011. And the water protests and all of the controversy that went on around that time. And that's when I began to notice hostility towards mainstream media or traditional media, whatever you want to say. And I think that has only grown actually over the years, in recent years.
Is it dangerous?
Well, for some of our reporters, it can be quite risky, yeah. And I mean, we've done sort of hostile environment training with some.
Have you?
Yeah, well, all news organisations would have done that. Yeah.
What's that involve?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I didn't do it. So the studio isn't a hostile environment just yet. Yeah.
I'm surprised at that.
Yeah.
They don't really sell that to you when they're selling the idea of journalism.
No.
Tell me about nowadays. So the question I use in this podcast format is, what did you have for dinner last night?
For dinner last night, I had some salmon, actually.
Salmon?
Yeah.
With?
And with potatoes. And some green beans.
Very nice.
And a very nice kind of, I think it was sort of a mustardy kind of a sauce. Actually, I was out for dinner last night. So this was
I was thinking, I was like, God, I might go over there for dinner.
It was my wife's birthday, so we went to dinner.
Very nice.
And she had fish as well. She had a cod with some prawns. It was very nice, yeah. So
what does she do?
She works for an estate agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And has done for
the last 15 years or so, yeah.
And where did you meet?
Yeah. We met on Inishboffin Island in County Galway.
Wow. In what year?
1982.
You were the swashbuckling reporter fresh on the scene.
No, I was working in pirate radio. I wasn't long out of college. I mean, I'd still been in college. I can't remember. And I had just gone for the weekend, the August Bank holiday weekend, and her parents families should have a small holiday cottage on the island, and she was there staying with her parents. So that's where we met.
Very good. And you've been married for?
We're married since 1988.
Wow. What's the secret to that?
I don't know. Well, never end the day with a row simmering. That's the first thing. Always, clear anything that's there cleared up before you pack it in for the day. That's it. And she would say, I think, communication.
Okay.
Generally.
Yes, I've heard that one.
Yeah, definitely. Keep talking about stuff. Yeah. And I would say have your own interests as well. And we do have some different interests as well as a few shared ones.
What are your interests outside of what we know, which is news reading?
Oh, right. Well, I had food, and I'm in a wine club, so that's a nice excuse to drink nice wine on a Thursday once a month. And I read a good bit. I'm reading more now, which is great. I've lots more time for reading. I like to sail. That's my sort of definitely my escape. Sailing boats.
It's out in Dublin Bay. That's a long way from the news.
Yeah, anywhere I can get on a boat. Yeah. So,
and tell me a couple of the quick fire questions again, just to get a sense of Bryan the person. If I were to say your signature dish.
Oh, chicken of some sort.
Chicken.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't. Maybe this goes back to my childhood. On a Sunday, we would always have a roast chicken. Dinner.
Okay.
And I still love a roast chicken, but actually I don't cook it very often because I did when we've two daughters. They're grown up now and they've left home. But when they were at home, we used to cook a chicken and I'd do the roast potatoes and all that. And that would be generally one of my tasks was to prepare that. And we don't really do it now because you don't cook a chicken for two people, particularly when one of them doesn't eat meat. So
really? Okay.
My wife is pescatarian, I think.
Yeah.
And she might eat chicken sometimes, but it would need to be organic, free range, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it sort of upsets her. So yeah, I'm like that's pretty boring, is it?
It's
yeah.
All your choices to date have been simple but quality.
Right, okay, well I'll take that.
And quite detailed in the potatoes have to have butter and salt and they need to be of a certain variety and chicken needs to be organic and free range.
In recent times we've taken to cooking potatoes in a little bit of duck or goose fat.
Yeah, I love it.
Parboil them and rough them up a bit and then into the tray, the hot fat in the tray. That's absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
Do you do takeaway?
Very little now.
If you were to do takeaway, where are you going?
We've very good Indian near us.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't do much takeaway, no. Partly because I've tried to kind of put a bit more discipline into my food routine in recent years to lose a bit of weight.
Okay.
Which I've succeeded in doing for health and mainly for health reasons. I said about it. So I like to sort of be a bit more in control of what I'm eating.
The worst meal of your life. Because the best meal of your life is an incredibly boring question.
The worst meal of my life.
If there's a standout.
I don't know. I mean, I can't really think of a worst meal.
Generally, when they're worst, it's the people as opposed to the actual
occasion,
food that have been around. I never tee anyone up on this for this piece. It's always interesting to get people's kind of first honest reaction.
My mother always struggled with the concept of a stew.
The poor mother. Yeah. The mother's getting hammered.
And my mother's stew really was a bit of a disaster. Sorry, mother.
On Tuesdays. Tuesday was stew.
I think that was Thursday.
Okay. I'm very interested in what you were going to say to this one. So I give you a table of 4.
Oh, 4.
4 guests, dream dinner guests.
Oh. Well, I told you I was a sailor. So there's a famous Irish sailor. I mean, they can be dead or alive, I presume.
Yeah, oh God, yeah.
So there's a famous sailor, long dead, called Conor O'Brien, who sailed around the world in the 1920s.
Not an easy task in the 1920s.
Before that, he was he was involved in the gun running. Not the Hoth one, but there was another boat at the same time. But anyway, so he was part of that sort of revolutionary movement. And then subsequently did this round the world trip and wrote about it and wrote a number of books about sailing. And he was a bit of an irascible fellow, apparently. But I'd be fascinated to meet him.
Okay,
he's long dead. I think he died in the 1950s.
So he's back. He's number 1.
So he might be one. And again, from the same era, I never really had the chance to interview people in the arts to the extent that I might have liked to. Not that I'd probably be much good at it, but I'm always fascinated by artists and writers, painters, sculptors. So I'd certainly have a couple of those if I could include them. Joyce, maybe.
Yep.
And again, they're people who do something that nobody's done before. Always interest me. So nobody had ever written like James Joyce had before he wrote. Conor O'Brien was one of the first people in the world to go around on a small boat, and certainly the first Irish person, something like that. A painter. I'm going to visit a Van Gogh exhibition in London now, hopefully in the next few weeks. I mean, there's an extraordinary, and he was a wonderful letter writer. I don't know if he spoke English, so I might have a difficulty.
I brought my good mother away recently, and it was artists. We would have gone to see the Paul Henrys as kids. But we went to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I was struck. She stood for at least, I'd say, 25, 30 minutes in front of the Van Gogh paintings, just absorbing it. And I remember thinking, like, I live in such a fast-paced world now where it's all phones and social media and work. And I was like, I hope I get to a point in life where I can stand 30 minutes in front of a painting and just be present.
Right, yeah. Well, I'll try that, although I expect there'll be so many people at this exhibition, it might be difficult to get a quiet space. So somebody like that. Again, nobody had ever painted like Van Gogh before he did. Monet was another, somebody who kind of broke the mold. Those kind of figures. Who else?
1 seat left. My
mother lived to a great age. She was in her 93rd year when she passed away in 2019. So, I had her company for many, many years. But my father died when I was still quite young. I was in my early 30s. He died in 1991. And I had lived for a good few previous years in Belfast. I'd worked for the BBC. And then I'd come back, and Cree and I had married, and we started a family, and we had Sophie, who was a small child at the time. And my father got ill, and he went downhill very quickly, and he passed away. And he wasn't 70; he was short of his 70th birthday. And I never really had the chance to kind of get to know him as an adult and just talk. And if I could sit with him again, Sorry, I hadn't expected to feel emotional about it. That's if I could.
Perfectly logical.
If I could shoot the breeze, I don't know whether I'd, sit over. We might go for a pint or something like that.
Yeah.
And we were quite different. And our interests really would have been, he was a very sporting kind of guy, but I think he was pleased to see me, the career. I was kind of getting places in that, and things were going well. But I'd like to have that chance. Yeah,
you probably have a few of his traits that you've kept with him.
Well, my sister keeps telling me I look more and more like him every passing year, so that's quite possible. And actually, some of our neighbours where I grew up make the same remark if I bump into them from time to time, and So, you know, I look in the mirror and I suppose I do see him all right. Yeah.
I think we've all felt that at some time as well. So
Yeah.
it's nice to hear from you.
Hmm.
What's the future now for Bryan Dobson? You still have a long way to go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm enjoying the early stages of retirement, and I have things that I'm involved in, and that kind of keeps me busy. And I've been asked to do a few different events and you know, professional engagements, and I'm doing a little bit of that. And I'm just kind of going with the flow and see how it goes. I don't have any big plans. Yeah.
I had a certain idea of what you'd be like coming in here. I've never met you personally. You seem like an incredibly content, happy person, even from our chat here for the last while.
Yeah, well, I feel very fortunate, Mark. I feel, you know, I've been blessed really. So, and you know, I don't think I've done anything to deserve it, but I suppose as well, in professional terms, I found something I enjoy doing that I think I was reasonably good at, that the work seemed to be appreciated, and I think particularly in broadcasting, you can feel, oh, I need to do the next thing. You know, I should have another further, you know, opportunity, or I want to do this show, or I want to do that show. And I just felt I'm doing what I'm doing, and I get asked, you know, would you not like to, you know, I don't know, do the Late Show or something like that? No interest, no, because I know I wouldn't be any good at it. So I found something I was reasonably good at. I've had a happy, in my personal life, I've been very blessed. 2 great daughters and a grandson now, and another grandchild on the way in the new year. So, yeah, what more can I ask for?
Bryan Dobson, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. If you like what you heard, you can like and subscribe, leave a review, or even just tell a friend about the podcast. You can watch our full conversation on YouTube, including Bryan and his potatoes in front of me. And I will see you next time.